I've loved the poetry of Juan Ramon Jimenez, the Spanish Nobel Prize winner. I wrote an essay which was published in the emagazine Pemmican in the summer of 2004. I'd like to read that essay here. Juan Ramon Jimenez's name rolls off the tongue with a natural fluidity. His poetry dances lightly like water, which evaporates into mist and ions, empowered by an earthy spirituality. Jimenez did not write of politics, religion, or evil, although he paid attention to those forces. He focused on the beauty he found in the world. He stopped his judgmental rationality to absorb the secrets of the natural universe. He did not want to be distracted by raucous clatter. In his 1956 essay, To Burn Completely, written near the end of his life and after his wife died, and after he stopped writing poetry, he explains, I quote a paragraph: "When we contemplate things and beings, when we love them and enjoy them, when we have their confidence, having given them ours, when we concern ourselves with them through our complete consciousness and as complete consciousness, they manifest their content to us. We shall possess their most profound secrets, and thus they will be able to offer themselves to us as an ideal, for perhaps the ideal may be a secret of which the most loving are worthy." End of quote. The secrets of the universe enthralled him. They held his attention gently, as if he were their possession, and it did belong to them, just as lovers share timeless communication when they silently contemplate each other. Juan Ramon Jimenez was a consciousness observing the contrasts of the world about. He opened all his senses to the world, and he used poetry as a method to share the world and the immanence, his word, of the spirit with other human beings. For the most part, Jimenez-lined poetry is lighter and quicker to flight than his prose poetry, just as a waterfall transforms water to energy faster than a deep pool. But like a deep pool, the prose poetry is more reflective. Platero and I is a collection of prose poems and conversations with his donkey, Platero, in his Andalusian home in Moher, Spain. The book is pure poetry of a reflective nature. In the selection Chills, on a dark evening when Platero and he were crossing a quiet pool of water, they gazed upon the reflected moon. When Platero stepped onto the moon, it transformed into, quote, a swarm of clear crystal roses, unquote. What a loving appreciation of the moon, the water, the moment, and the activity. The entire setting is alive, and it participates in this poem. Without all the participants, the poem would be false. Jimenez's full participation in the context of nature enlivened his prose poetry. He did not create improbabilities or fantastic, incongruous visions. I suppose one could argue that a reflected moon stepped on by a donkey could not transform into flower petals, but it does so visually outside of Jimenez and not inside his imagination. The reflections pull from him and Platero, who is ever chewing petals and leaves. It pulls the memory of flowers. Thus they live through the beauty of the reflected moon, the quiet splash of the hoof step, and the spiritual reality of flower petals rippling in darkness. Jimenez shared this moment with the reader. He did not create fantasies. Rather, he reports on what he sees and knows and remembers of the world. He did not write fiction. He was meditative and appreciative of the world's ugliness, that boneyard where the dying horses were taken, though he buries Platero on a hill beneath a pine tree. He wrote of the beauty in sorrow and joy. Jimenez wrote more simply than most poets. His advantage was not in fictionalization, but in the use of his consciousness to turn and fill itself, then to turn and empty itself. Again, from To Burn Completely. Quote, what a man imagines cannot be more than inner imagery, or a more or less beautiful modification of what is outside him, of what he feels with his bodily and spiritual five senses. There is nothing more filled with spirit than the senses. Unquote. If, as Robert Bly has written, Jimenez's poetry is as light as a spark, it is so because he was an adept craftsman with a consciousness like a water glass, which filled and emptied to more lips and more water than any glass sitting filled and still. With its simple words, the poetry is the secret essence of his experience, alive like a spark and sprung loose by a fiery, unselfish mind. It is difficult for me not to get carried away with so much beauty and the deep contemplative excitement in his work, which is not limited to the landscapes and streets of his Mujer. In an especially sad and beautiful prose poem, The Negress and the Rose, Jimenez offered the reader, quote, the negress is falling asleep with a white rose in her hand, unquote. We share the description of the woman, her softly colored clothes, and the delicacy of her dreams. Only in the final paragraph does the reader realize that the scene occurs on a subway. Quote, noisy, clashing blackness, both warm and dirty. All have abandoned their newspapers, their gum, their cries, as in a nightmare of weariness and sadness. They are absorbed in this white rose. Unquote. The rose masters everything. Quote, all is, for a moment, perfumed by the white rose, by a better springtime, by eternity. Unquote. This poem, as with most of Jimenez's poems, seeks and finds eternity and the eternally lived moment. Russell Edson said in The Prose Poem in America, quote, poetry is inherently joyous, no matter how gloomy its seeming contents sometimes seems. This is because time does not destroy its energy as it does with prose. Prose is always running out through time. Poetry, by its psychology, celebrates everything it touches. Its psychology is based in the idea of eternal life. Unquote. Juan Ramon Jimenez is celebratory, using the most mundane and the most obvious symbols to write of eternity and the infinite. In A Cemetery on Broadway, surrounded by the rapid transit systems, he finds that, quote, the purity, little as it is, and embattled as it is infinite, and the single red flower which the slanting sun glorifies upon a tombstone fill with poetry this terrible hour of 5 o'clock. Flowers were a much used motif by Jimenez, but sunlight is pervasive in his work. Very few poems, prose or lined, do not mention sunlight or its gradient colors. Color and light are the woof and warp of his poems. He preferred the muted, mallow pink lights of sunset. Quote, tombstones tinged here and there with the color of the heart. The sun setting against the cathedral. The tips of pink flame in the dark green. Unquote. In his Platero poems, he is out of doors soaking the sunlight or the moonlight or in, quote, peaceful, subdued retreat of the village twilight. Unquote. Nightfall Scarlet Landscape begins, quote, hilltop. Over there is the sunset, all wounded and bleeding from its own blades of light. Unquote. To live out of doors in the sun and fields was, for Jimenez, the ultimate existence. Quote, there is no more exquisite form of aristocracy than living out of doors. Unquote. Jimenez was a pantheist and mystic who happened to write poems. His attention to light, color, and the effects of light on his body attests to his sensitivity. Light has its blades and its fire. It wounded him, nourished him, and assuaged his nervous system. I can think of no poet since Tu Fu who was as sensitive to the multiplicity of light gradients and hues. No poem of his was complete unless some mention of the sun, the moon, or light bound the poem. Only the great poets use again and again the same words without boring the reader. Jimenez was one. As a naturalist and a pantheist, the light and sun were the physical essence of life and companions to spiritual essences. Despite this fascination, Jimenez did not neglect human beings. His Platero poems are filled with characters and human interaction, as are his New York prose poems. His negress fell asleep with a rose, and he found dynamism in her dreams. Platero and I has children almost as predominant as Platero, or as decorative as the sunlight and flowers. Children dance with the poet, race the donkey, squeal raucously, and ask many questions. But Jimenez did not naively surround himself with children and innocence. He pointed out the cruelty of children in The Crazy Man, where the children taunt him and Platero. But with his delicacy of craft, he put that taunting into a beautiful perspective. By merely detailing the surroundings, quote, the vast pure sky of burning indigo, unquote, or the, quote, children's tense brown bellies through their red, green, and yellow rags, unquote. He focused attention to a larger, whole existent, not small reactionary taunts. As a man of his senses, he lived fully, with a scope larger than human cruelty. Another character is Darbon. Quote, Darbon, Platero's doctor, is as large as a piebald ox, as red as a watermelon. Unquote. Darbon is a man as gentle as a child and filled with his own sadness. Though he laughs at the sight of a flower or a little bird, he weeps at the thought of his own dead child. In the New York poems, Juan Ramon found characters on the streets or even on signs. From a mere public announcement, he found Pastor A. Ray Petty, who preached of God in baseball sermons entitled, quote, The Pinch Hitter, The Sacrifice Fly, Game Called on Account of Darkness, unquote. Also, in New York was the King of the City, a black cripple singing, limping alone in the early dawn, and the Polish giant, a Whitmanesque figure who unwittingly lived in Whitman's house. These were exemplary individuals, characters who fit Jimenez's ideal of the true aristocrat. In 1941, he wrote an essay, Aristocracy and Democracy. In this essay, he tried to describe the difference between the false aristocrats, especially European, and true aristocrats. For him, aristocracy was a state of being that was not dependent on material wealth, familial lineage, or government grant. Quote, Aristocracy, in my opinion, is a state of man in which are united in supreme union a profound cultivation of the interior being and a conviction of the natural simplicity of living, idealism and economy. The Spanish peasant is a pantheist and a mystic, and therefore delicate, fine, generous, because he loves. For mysticism and pantheism are love, and love is a good sign of aristocracy. Unquote. I asked myself, while reading this essay, if these words were not really an apology for his own aristocratic background and his own love and attachment to the peasants and children. As an educated aristocrat who eccentrically rode the streets on his donkey, wore a black hat and simple clothes, his beard, quote, cut like the Nazarenes, unquote, did he try to justify his own lollygagging about the fields, playing with children and enjoying the simplicity of his life? The two-sided essay is filled with idealism and intellectual astuteness, but no naivete. As I have mentioned, ideals were secrets for which a person must be worthy. He, unlike, quote, tenth-rate men, unquote, found some answers in his simplicity. His contempt for contrived behavior came out in the Authors Club, where literary men aspire to largeness by cultivating appearances of truly great writers and poets. In this prose poem, Jimenez expresses his desire to burn down the false place, or at least burn a piece of the carpet, as a small act of rebellion against the pretentious writers. In another essay, Poetry and Literature, he wrote, quote, Literature, however perfect it may be, is always artificial. The more artificial, the more perfect. Through literature, it is possible to arrive at a relative beauty, but poetry is beyond relative beauty, and its expression aspires to absolute beauty. Pretentious literature must be content to reach a mirrored beauty by a complicated rite. Literature can secure the gleam of poetry in its glass when it is copied from poetic writing by the latter's imitators. Unquote. How exactly he pointed out the difference between true poets and the men who posture and try to appear literary, and use false, secretive rituals for membership in their club. In Aristocracy and Democracy, he wrote of the Spanish writer. He did not call him a poet. Salvador Rueda, who, quote, put on the worst kind of espadrilles to seem of the people, unquote. Of course, Rueda was unable to share the consciousness of the people. I'm reminded of a group of blonde, flashy North American tourists I saw in Mexico City. They witnessed the traditional bell-ringing grito by the Mexican president, at the time Portillo Lopez. The celebration in the Zocalo included fireworks, bells, and especially the grito to commemorate independence from Spain. The Americans, with gaudy, faked Aztec baubles, wore new, inelegant, and cute Mexican clothes. Caught in the hysteria with 100,000 others, they screamed with excessive exuberance, "Viva Mexico! Viva Mexico!" Yet they were offended when a young Mexican in tattered clothes threw, instead of confetti, a handful of lime into their faces. They could not comprehend the falseness of their behavior on foreign soil. In Platero and I, another false character is Don Jose, the village priest, quote, riding along sanctimoniously and speaking honey words. But the one who in fact is always angelic is his she-donkey, a real lady, unquote. What a contrast. The aristocrat is a donkey, not the priest who hurls rocks at children. This character also contrasts with Jimenez himself, who plays in the fields with the children, who lets them ride his donkey and shares grapes and flowers with them. Juan Ramon Jimenez sought the ideal, the secrets of the spirit and the universe. Again, from To Burn Completely. Quote, the true man, the authentic man, the inherent cultivated aristocrat, who unites the greatest sensitivity in daily life to the great richness of a greater life, is he who most desires the happiness of the world, he who seeks his own happiness in the universal happiness, he who succeeds by means of a clear concept of the whole life of the world, in best occupying, using, and enjoying his space and time, unquote. Or, from the essay Poetry and Literature, quote, in reality, the poet, when mute or when writing, is an abstract dancer, and if he writes, it is out of everyday weakness. For to be truly consistent, he ought not write, unquote. I cannot say whether Jimenez pursued an ideal from his earliest days, or if he finally, in his old age, found explanations and justifications for his manner of living. Yet there is no doubt that he lived with a deep appreciation of the basic essences of life, light, nature, animals, children, and keen emotional contact with the world. Because Juan Ramon Jimenez believed in the existence of ideals, as obscure or as secretive as they are, he shared what he found. Joy emanates from his poetry, even his most painful, because it is accessible to anyone. Platero and I is a children's classic throughout the Spanish-speaking world. Its clarity and authenticity of emotion, its description, without too harsh a judgment or cruelty and false behavior, appeals to the uninhibited consciousness. His New York poems were energized both by his acute perceptions and his excitement as a visitor in a new place. When read together with the poems of Platero, we are fortunate to read of a pastoral setting, familiar and intricate for the poet, and of the urban chaos, its beauty, secretive yet available to the worthy seeker. Another joy for me as a reader is that I can pick up Jimenez's poems, prose or lined, and turn a page forward or backward, and not be subjected to the constraints of narrative and plot direction. Again, Russell Edson says, quote, prose is inherently a tragic form. Time, the bringer, finally ruins everything. Prose brings things into existence, only to have them disappear down into the end of the plot. No matter what the so-called happy ending fictions end at, the last word as poetry does not. When we reread a work of fiction, we go back for the poetry, the permanent parts. Unquote. It's no wonder that Jimenez sought the ideal, whether consciously or subconsciously throughout his life. He sought eternity and the universality of poetry. His simple language and accessibility can touch the innermost seat of communion. As he wrote, listening to the water, in the Platero poems, after listening and listening, he communicated with, quote, the interior of the world, unquote. He became one with the water and the world. Then he saw a man across the water who says he had been listening for 30 years. That man exclaims in the poem, quote, just imagine the things she has told me, the things I have heard, end quote.